"Your empire doesn't fear enemies," Ethan Cole said, his voice steady despite the cold air biting at his skin. "It fears kindness." The chamber stretched wide beneath a ceiling of translucent alloy, pale violet light bleeding through like a distant storm, casting long reflections across the polished floor where Ethan stood restrained inside a faintly humming containment field, its surface shimmering just inches from his outstretched fingers, the temperature hovering just above freezing, cold enough that his breath curled visibly with each exhale, and yet he didn't shiver. Not anymore, because fear had already burned itself out somewhere between the moment they arrested him and the moment they announced his trial to the entire empire, broadcasting his face across 1,000 systems as an example of what happened to those who broke imperial law, though if anyone had asked him, he would have said he didn't break anything that mattered, not really, because saving someone shouldn't count as a crime, not where he came from, not on Earth, not in the quiet shipping lanes where he used to spend his days calibrating cargo routes and arguing with outdated navigation software, not in the simple life he understood, where right and wrong weren't decided by councils or codes but by whether you could live with yourself after making a choice, and he still could, even now, even here, even as the hum of the field pressed softly against his bones and the distant murmur of unseen observers echoed through the chamber like a low mechanical tide, watching, judging, waiting, and then the doors opened without sound. Just a shift in the light, a subtle dimming as the air itself seemed to acknowledge her presence before he even saw her, Empress Lyra Vera, moving with measured precision down the length of the chamber, her form outlined in silver and deep blue, her skin catching the ambient glow like polished glass beneath starlight, every step deliberate, controlled, as if the ground itself existed only to carry her forward, and when she stopped a few feet from the containment field, the silence sharpened. Became something heavier, something that pressed in on Ethan's chest in a way the cold never could, her eyes fixed on him, luminous, unreadable, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the faint oscillation of the energy barrier between them, until she tilted her head just slightly, as though adjusting to something unfamiliar, something out of place, and the system embedded along the chamber walls flickered briefly, a cascade of data streaming in invisible patterns that Ethan couldn't see but could almost feel, like static brushing against his thoughts. Measuring him, analyzing him, failing, perhaps, because her gaze narrowed just a fraction, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, precise, carrying the weight of 1,000 decisions made without hesitation. "You were given the chance to comply," she said, not unkindly, not harshly, simply stating a fact as she understood it, and Ethan let out a slow breath, watching it fade into the cold air before meeting her eyes directly, because there didn't seem to be any point in looking away. Now, not when everything was already decided, or so they thought. "I was given the chance to abandon someone who needed help," he replied, his tone quiet but unyielding. "That's not the same thing," and for the first time, something shifted, not in the chamber, not in the field, but in her, subtle as a glitch in perfect code, her fingers still at her side yet pausing just long enough to be noticed, a fraction of a second, a hesitation that shouldn't exist in someone like her, someone who ruled entire systems without doubt or delay, and yet it was there, small but undeniable, like a hairline crack forming beneath a flawless surface, and the system flickered again, just for an instant, as if it too had noticed something it couldn't quite process, something that didn't fit, something human. The field hummed a little louder, or maybe Ethan was just noticing it now, the way it pressed against the air like a held breath, waiting for something to change, while Empress Lyra Vera stood perfectly still on the other side, her gaze no longer scanning him like an object but lingering, as if she had encountered a variable that refused to resolve, and somewhere above them, unseen mechanisms adjusted, faint clicks echoing through the chamber as environmental systems recalibrated, lowering the temperature another degree, a quiet reminder that discomfort was part of the process here, that compliance often followed pressure, but Ethan did not move, did not shift his stance or wrap his arms around himself for warmth. He simply stood there, shoulders squared, breathing slow and steady, as though he had all the time in the world, and that, more than anything, seemed to unsettle the rhythm of the room, because time was something this empire controlled, measured, dictated, and yet he treated it like it belonged to him. "Your records show no prior defiance," Lyra said after a moment, her voice softer now, not weaker, but more focused, as if she had narrowed the entire universe down to a single question. "No history of rebellion, no ideological affiliation, No strategic value in opposing imperial law, she took one step closer to the field, the faint light catching along the edges of her form, outlining her in a quiet glow. So explain it, and Ethan almost smiled, not out of humor, but because the question itself felt human, the need to understand instead of simply enforce, and he shifted his weight slightly, the metal beneath his boots cold and smooth, grounding him in a way the flickering data around them could not. There is nothing to explain, he said, his voice even. She was scared. She was alone, and she needed help. He paused just long enough for the words to settle, not forcing them, not dressing them up, just letting them exist as they were, simple and unpolished. So I helped her, and the silence that followed was different this time, not empty, but full of something unspoken, like a space waiting to be filled but refusing anything artificial. And Lyra's eyes shifted, just slightly, not away from him but inward, as though she was comparing his answer against something deeper than protocol, something older than the Empire itself. And for a brief second, the systems along the walls flickered again, a soft cascade of unreadable signals that stuttered and corrected, like a heartbeat skipping under pressure, and then a tone sounded, low and distant. Barely audible but unmistakable, a notification, an interruption, and Lyra did not look toward its source, did not acknowledge it in any visible way, but the air changed, tension threading through the space as if something beyond these walls had taken notice. You understand the consequence, she said, though it felt less like a warning and more like a statement she was trying to confirm for herself, and Ethan nodded once. A small motion, but certain. I understand what your laws say, he replied, meeting her gaze without hesitation. I just do not agree with them, and that was it. No defiance in his tone, no anger, just a quiet refusal to bend, and for a moment, Lyra did not respond, her expression unchanged, yet something in her posture shifted, almost imperceptible, like gravity had adjusted by a fraction, and then she raised her hand, not in command, not in dismissal, but in pause. And the containment field flickered, its surface distorting like heat over pavement before stabilizing again, and the system voice, smooth and neutral, echoed faintly through the chamber, directive awaiting confirmation. And Lyra stood there, her hands suspended between decision and delay, her eyes still locked on the human who had given her an answer that should have meant nothing, and yet somehow meant everything she could not yet define. The system did not like hesitation, that much was clear, because the moment her hand remained suspended without resolution, the chamber responded, lights dimming by a fraction, the hum of the containment field sharpening into a tighter frequency, not louder but more precise, as if narrowing its focus, while the distant tone repeated once more, a quiet insistence that decisions here were meant to be immediate, final, unquestioned. And yet Lyra Vera did not lower her hand, did not speak the command that every protocol expected. She simply stood there, her gaze steady on Ethan Cole, as though the rest of the Empire had momentarily ceased to exist. And for the first time since he had been brought into this chamber, Ethan noticed something else beneath the controlled stillness of her presence, not weakness, not doubt exactly, but friction, like two perfectly aligned systems beginning to misalign by the smallest measurable degree. You place individual need above structural order, she said slowly, the words chosen with care, as if she were testing them even as she spoke them, and Ethan tilted his head just slightly, not dismissive, just considering. I place people above rules that forget why they exist, he answered, his voice calm, steady, unshaken by the pressure in the air, and Lyra's eyes narrowed by the smallest fraction, not in anger, but in focus, because that answer did not resolve, it expanded, introducing variables that her systems were not designed to simplify. And somewhere along the chamber walls, data streams flickered again, faster this time, overlapping signals that corrected themselves just as quickly, a cascade of logic attempting to stabilize, and then, without warning, the temperature shifted, rising by a few degrees. Subtle but noticeable, the cold edge softening, and Ethan exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in awareness, because changes here were never accidental, every adjustment carried intent, and he watched her carefully now, not as a ruler, not as an authority, but as something far more uncertain, something in motion. The individual you assisted, Lyra continued, her tone quieter, more precise, was classified as restricted biological property, non-compliant, and designated for containment. She paused. And this time the pause lingered just long enough to feel deliberate. You altered that outcome, and Ethan nodded once, no hesitation. Yes, he said, and for a moment, the word seemed to hang there, simple, unguarded, refusing to carry anything beyond its truth, and Lyra's fingers moved, just slightly, lowering from their suspended position but not completing the gesture the system awaited, and the field flickered again, its surface rippling like disturbed water before stabilizing. The system voice returning, softer now, almost cautious, directive remains unconfirmed, and something in the way it spoke suggested that even the mechanisms of this empire were beginning to account for uncertainty, and Lyra finally shifted her stance, one measured step closer, bringing her within arm's reach of the barrier, the faint glow reflecting in her eyes as she studied him, not as a subject, not as a violation, but as a contradiction she could not ignore. "Why did you not request clemency?" she asked, and this time the question carried something different, not authority, not interrogation, but curiosity stripped of its usual distance, and Ethan let out a slow breath, watching it fade between them. "Because I was not sorry," he replied, and there it was again, that friction. Sharper now, more defined, the kind that could not be smoothed over by protocol or rewritten by code, and Lyra's expression did not change, not outwardly, but her eyes held his for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring something beyond data, beyond logic, beyond anything her empire had ever needed to understand, and in that quiet, suspended moment, the chamber felt smaller, not physically, but in meaning, as if the vast weight of law and order had narrowed down to a single choice that had not yet been made, and for the first time, it was not clear which outcome the system was truly waiting for. The chamber adjusted again, not with sound this time but with presence, a subtle shift in the air pressure that pressed gently against Ethan's lungs, as if the space itself had begun to respond to something unseen beyond the walls, and Lyra felt it too, the signal threading through her neural interface before the system could even voice it, a silent alert transmitted directly into the architecture of her authority. The council was watching now, not passively, not distantly, but actively, their observation locking into the chamber like a second layer of gravity, and for the first time since she entered, Lyra did not look only at Ethan, her gaze flickered, just for a fraction of a second, toward the upper edges of the room where no physical eyes existed, and yet everything was being seen, recorded, judged, and the realization settled with a quiet weight. This moment was no longer contained. It was no longer hers alone, external oversight engaged, the system finally announced, its tone smooth but edged with something sharper than before, something closer to warning, and Ethan caught the shift immediately, not in the words, but in her posture, the almost imperceptible straightening of her shoulders, the recalibration of distance between them, as if invisible lines had just been drawn around her again, pulling her back into something larger than herself, and for a moment, he wondered if that was it, if whatever hesitation he had seen would be erased now, overwritten by expectation, by structure, by the sheer weight of an empire that did not tolerate deviation. And yet she did not step back, she did not increase the distance, instead she remained exactly where she was, close enough that the faint glow of the field reflected in both their eyes, two different species separated by inches and an entire system of belief. "You are aware," Lyra said, her voice steady again but carrying a new layer beneath it, something controlled, something observed, that your actions have triggered systemic review. And Ethan gave a small nod, not surprised, not concerned in any visible way, just acknowledging what had already been inevitable. "That sounds like something your system needs," he replied, and there was no sarcasm in it, no challenge, just a quiet statement that landed differently than it should have, because it did not resist, it did not provoke, it simply existed, and Lyra felt that again, that friction, sharper now under the presence of the council, because their systems did not accommodate statements that did not push or yield, they required alignment, and he refused to align, not aggressively, not loudly, just by standing still in his own reasoning, and the chamber lights dimmed another fraction, the violet hue deepening as if reacting to the increased oversight, while the containment field tightened its oscillation, a subtle visual distortion running across its surface like a ripple held in place, and Lyra's hand lowered fully now, but still she did not issue the command. Still she did not confirm the directive that the system continued to wait for. "Compliance ensures stability," she said, the words sounding almost automatic, drawn from a place she had repeated them countless times before, and Ethan's eyes did not leave hers. "Stability for who?" he asked quietly, and that was the moment something shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, because the question did not attack the system, it questioned its purpose, and Lyra felt it move through her, not as data, not as input, but as something unresolved, something that did not return an immediate answer, and above them, unseen, the council's presence tightened, the system voice pausing for a fraction longer before repeating. Directive awaiting confirmation, but now it sounded different, not just procedural, but expectant, as if even the structure of the Empire was leaning into this moment, waiting to see which version of her would respond, the Empress who upheld every law without hesitation, or the one standing here now, inches from a human who had done something so simple it had become impossible to ignore, and Lyra did not move. Not yet, her gaze steady, her breath measured, as the silence stretched longer than it ever should have, long enough to become its own kind of answer. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the chamber until even the hum of the containment field seemed to lower itself in response, as if the entire system had begun to listen rather than enforce, and Ethan stood within it, still, grounded, his breath slow and steady, while Lyra remained just beyond the barrier, her presence unwavering but no longer distant. The space between them no longer defined solely by energy and law but by something far more fragile, something that had not yet been named, and above them the unseen weight of the council intensified, not through sound but through pressure, a tightening in the air, a subtle shift in the rhythm of the system itself, as though countless decisions were aligning toward a single expected outcome, and yet that outcome remained unspoken, unconfirmed, because she had not given it, she had not fulfilled the directive that had always been simple before, always immediate, always certain, stability for all governed systems. Lyra said finally, her voice measured, composed, but carrying an echo now, something that suggested she was not just repeating doctrine but testing it against the moment, and Ethan watched her carefully, not challenging, not pushing, just present. That sounds like a system that protects itself first, he replied quietly, and the words did not strike, they settled, like weight placed carefully on something already under strain, and Lyra felt it, not as resistance, but as imbalance, because the logic held, it always had. The Empire functioned because it maintained control, because it removed variables, because it ensured that no single deviation could disrupt the whole, and yet here he stood, a deviation so small, so singular, and still he had disrupted something far greater than himself, something inside her that did not respond to command or correction, and for a moment, she shifted her gaze away from him, not in dismissal, but in reflection, her eyes moving toward the far wall where faint streams of data continued to flow, endless, precise, structured, and she had trusted those streams her entire life, relied on them to define order, to eliminate uncertainty, to maintain what they called balance, but now, in this chamber, with the council watching and the system waiting, those streams felt incomplete, as if they had been built to exclude something essential, something inconvenient, something human, and her fingers moved again, not toward command, but toward the field itself, hovering just inches from its surface, the energy responding with a soft distortion where her presence neared. And for the first time, she did not view it as a barrier meant to separate, but as a line drawn by a system that assumed distance was necessary, and Ethan noticed the shift, not in her movement, but in her stillness, the way she held that position without finalizing it, as if she were standing at the edge of a decision that had no precedent. If I confirm the directive, she said slowly, her voice quieter now, more contained, the system remains intact, and she paused, just long enough for the implication to exist without being spoken, and Ethan did not rush to fill it, did not argue or plead, he simply nodded once, acknowledging the truth of it, and then she continued, her gaze returning to him, sharper. Now, more focused than before, if I do not, and this time she did not finish the sentence, because she did not need to, the outcome was understood, not just by him, not just by her, but by everything watching, and the system voice returned, softer than ever, almost hesitant, directive awaiting confirmation, and Lyra stood there, her hands still suspended near the field, her mind no longer aligning perfectly with the structure around her, because for the first time, the choice before her was not between right and wrong as defined by the Empire, but between control and something far less predictable, something that could not be measured or contained, something that stood on the other side of the barrier, breathing slowly, waiting without fear, and in that moment, the Empire did not feel vast, it felt narrow, and the space between them did not feel like separation, it felt like a question she had not yet decided how to answer. The air held its breath with her, that was the only way Ethan could understand it, because nothing in the chamber moved yet everything felt poised on the edge of motion, like a system waiting for a command that had always come without delay, and now did not, and Lyra Vera stood at the center of that pause, her hand still suspended near the containment field, close enough that the faint energy shimmer bent softly around her fingers, reacting without being touched, as if even the barrier could sense the uncertainty behind the gesture, and above them the invisible presence of the council tightened further, not through sound but through expectation, a silent pressure that pressed against every surface, every system, every line of code that governed the empire, urging resolution, urging compliance, urging her to return to what had always worked, what had always been unquestioned, and yet the longer she remained still, the more that expectation began to feel like something external, rather than absolute, something imposed rather than inherent, and that realization did not arrive as a sudden thought but as a slow shift, a recalibration that moved through her awareness like a ripple through still water, altering the shape of everything it touched. And Ethan watched her, not with urgency, not with fear, but with a quiet attentiveness that made no demand of her decision, and that absence of demand created space, space that the system had never accounted for, space where a choice could exist without pressure to justify itself, and Lyra felt it, that space, unfamiliar and unstructured, and for a moment she allowed herself to stand within it, without reaching for protocol, without aligning with the directives that had always guided her, and in that moment the chamber changed, not physically, not in any measurable way, but in meaning, the distance between them no longer defined by control but by possibility, and her hand moved, not forward, not yet, but slightly to the side, as if adjusting her own position within that space, and the containment field responded with a faint fluctuation, a brief thinning of its visual distortion before stabilizing again, and the system voice returned, softer than before, almost uncertain, directive. Awaiting confirmation, but the words no longer carried the same authority, they sounded like a request now, or perhaps a reminder, and Lyra lowered her hand slowly, deliberately, but instead of issuing the command the system expected, she turned her palm outward, away from the control interface embedded along the chamber wall, a subtle but unmistakable deviation, and the data streams flickered sharply in response, patterns destabilizing for a fraction of a second before reassembling into something less certain, less precise, and Ethan saw it, not the data itself but the effect, the way the light shifted, the way the hum of the field lost its perfect consistency, and he understood, not fully, but enough to know that something was changing, something that extended far beyond this room, and Lyra stepped closer again, closing the distance until the barrier was the only thing separating them, her eyes steady on his, no longer searching for an answer but acknowledging one that had already formed, even if it had not yet been spoken. Your kind does not require permission to act, she said quietly, the statement carrying neither judgment nor approval, just recognition, and Ethan gave a small nod, the motion simple, grounded. We try not to, he replied, and there was a faint shift in her expression then, not quite a smile, not quite anything that had a name in the systems that defined her, but something softer, something that existed outside of structure, and for the first time since she had entered the chamber, Lyra did not feel the need to resolve that feeling, did not categorize it or suppress it, she simply allowed it to remain, and the silence that followed was no longer tense, no longer waiting, it was settled, as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than command, and all that remained was the moment when the Empire would realize it. The shift did not go unnoticed, not by the system, not by the Council, and certainly not by the architecture of power that had never been designed to accommodate uncertainty, because the moment Lyra's hand turned away from command, the chamber responded in a way it never had before, the lights flickering not in failure but in recalibration, as if the environment itself was attempting to interpret a signal it had no reference for, and the containment field pulsed once, a low oscillation that rolled across its surface like a wave that had nowhere to go, while above them the unseen presence sharpened into something more defined, no longer passive observation but active intervention, and this time the system voice did not wait, it spoke immediately, its tone no longer neutral but edged with authority that did not originate from her, override protocol engaged, and the words settled into the air like a foreign gravity, heavy, undeniable, and Lyra felt at the moment it arrived, not as sound but as pressure within her own neural interface, an external command threading into her control pathways, attempting to reassert alignment, to correct deviation, to restore the balance that had been momentarily disrupted, and for the first time in her existence as Empress, the system was not waiting for her decision, it was preparing to make one without her, and Ethan saw the change instantly, not in the data, not in the invisible commands, but in her, the subtle tension that moved through her posture, the way her breathing shifted by just a fraction, controlled but no longer perfectly even, and the space between them tightened again, not by her will, but by something far larger attempting to close it. They are removing your choice, Ethan said quietly, not accusing, not surprised, just stating what was already unfolding, and Lyra did not respond immediately, her gaze fixed forward, not on him now but somewhere deeper, somewhere internal where the system's override pressed against her authority, attempting to rewrite the outcome, and the chamber darkened another degree, the violet light dimming into something colder, more distant, as if the Empire itself had withdrawn its warmth from the moment, and the containment field intensified, its surface becoming more rigid, more defined, as though preparing to finalize the directive it had been awaiting, and then the system voice returned, louder this time, less patient. Directive escalation in progress, and that was the moment something broke, not visibly, not with force, but with clarity, because Lyra understood then that this was not about law, not about stability, not about order, it was about control, about ensuring that even she remained within the boundaries that had been constructed long before her, and the realization did not come with anger, it came with precision, sharp and undeniable, cutting through every layer of conditioning she had ever accepted, and her hand moved again, not hesitating this time, not searching for alignment, but reaching forward with intention, stopping just short of the containment field, her fingers hovering where the energy shimmered brightest, and the system reacted instantly, a cascade of alerts flashing through the unseen networks, the air tightening as if bracing for impact that would never come, and Ethan did not move, did not step back, he simply watched her, steady, present, trusting in something he could not define but had already chosen, and Lyra turned her gaze back to him, fully now, not divided, not calculating, but certain in a way that had nothing to do with protocol. No, she said, and the word was quiet, almost soft, but it carried through the chamber with more force than any command she had ever given, because it was not directed at him, it was directed at everything else, at the system, at the council, at the structure that had assumed her compliance would always be guaranteed, and for a fraction of a second, everything stopped, the lights, the field, the hum of the chamber itself, as if the Empire had encountered something it could not immediately process, and in that stillness, Lyra made her choice, not as Empress, not as a function of the system, but as something else entirely, something the Empire had never accounted for, and the moment stretched, suspended between what had always been and what was about to change. The word did not echo, it settled, and that was what made it irreversible, because nothing in the chamber was built to absorb refusal from her, not like this, not directed outward, not against the system itself, and for a fraction of a second the entire structure seemed to hesitate, as if recalculating its own foundation, the lights holding in a dimmed state, the containment field frozen mid-oscillation, the hum collapsing into a near silence that felt deeper than sound, and then the reaction came, not as force but as correction, the system surging back to life with a cascade of layered signals, data streams accelerating across unseen networks, the air tightening as control mechanisms attempted to reassert dominance, override escalation confirmed, the voice returned, sharper now, less neutral, its tone no longer designed to serve but to enforce, and Lyra felt it push against her again, stronger this time, a direct command threading into her authority pathways, attempting to bypass her decision entirely, to restore alignment by removing her from the equation, and for the first time, she resisted it consciously, not by force, not by struggle, but by refusal to yield, holding her position as if the simple act of remaining present could anchor something larger than herself, and Ethan watched it unfold, the invisible pressure, the subtle distortion in the air around her, the way the chamber seemed to lean against her decision, and he understood then that this was no longer about him, not really, this was about her, about what she chose to be when the system no longer allowed her to simply follow, and the containment field pulsed again, harder this time, its surface tightening as if preparing to finalize its function, and then something unexpected happened, not a break, not a collapse, but a shift in direction, because instead of reinforcing the barrier, the system rerouted, redirecting its energy toward her, not physically, not in a way that could be seen, but in the subtle reconfiguration of control that defined her role, attempting to isolate her authority, to compartmentalize it, to reduce her to a function once more, and Lyra felt that clearly, the narrowing of her command, the way the system attempted to limit her influence to predefined channels, and for a moment, she could have allowed it, could have stepped back into alignment, preserved the structure, maintained the balance, and everything would have returned to normal, the directive confirmed, the deviation corrected, the empire unchanged, but she did not move, she did not step back, instead she stepped forward, just one measured step, closing the last distance between herself and the containment field, and the chamber reacted instantly, alarms threading through the air in soft, controlled tones that signaled deviation without chaos, and the field flared brighter where she approached, its surface distorting more intensely, resisting proximity, reinforcing separation, and still she moved closer, her hand rising. Again, this time not stopping just short, this time crossing the threshold, her fingers passing through the shimmering boundary with a faint ripple, the energy bending around her instead of rejecting her, as if it had not been designed to prevent her from doing so, only to assume she never would, and Ethan felt the shift the moment it happened, the barrier between them no longer absolute, no longer defined by distance but by choice. And he did not step forward, did not reach out, he simply stood there, allowing the moment to exist without forcing it, and Lyra looked at him, fully now, without division, without interference, her eyes clear, steady, resolved, and the system voice tried once more. Its tone strained beneath its controlled surface, directive must be confirmed, but the words no longer held authority, they sounded distant, disconnected, and Lyra did not look away, did not withdraw her hand, instead she spoke, not to the system, not to the council, but to the truth that had formed within her, then it will not be, and in that moment, the empire did not collapse, it did not shatter, it simply encountered something it had never prepared for, a decision it could not override. A choice that existed outside its design, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of consequence, stretching outward beyond the chamber, beyond the walls, into every system that had just felt the shift without yet understanding what it meant. The chamber did not recover, not immediately, because systems built on certainty do not adapt to contradiction without pause, and in that pause something new began to exist, not chaos, not failure, but a space where control no longer dictated every outcome, and Lyra Vera stood within it, her hands still extended through what had once been an absolute boundary, the faint shimmer of the containment field bending gently around her fingers like light through water, no longer a barrier but a reminder of what had been assumed, and Ethan Cole remained where he was, steady, present, not stepping forward, not reaching out, because he understood that this moment did not belong to him, it belonged to her, to the choice she had made and the consequences that would follow, and the silence that filled the chamber was different now, not tense, not waiting, but vast, stretching outward beyond the walls into systems that were already reacting, recalibrating, attempting to define what had just occurred, and the system voice did not return, not because it could not, but because it no longer had a directive to enforce, the command it awaited had been denied, and there was no protocol for denial at this level, no predefined path for an empress who chose not to comply, and Lyra lowered her hand slowly, not withdrawing from the moment but completing it, allowing the field to reassert its form behind her fingers as they passed back through its surface with a soft distortion, and when her hand returned to her side, it did not feel like surrender, it felt like finality, and she looked at Ethan, not as a subject, not as a variable, but as something that had revealed a truth her empire had never accounted for, something simple and undeniable, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove. The choice had already been made, and its meaning did not require explanation, and then the chamber responded, not with force, not with correction, but with release, the containment field dissolving into a faint shimmer before fading entirely, its hum collapsing into silence, and the air shifted, warmer now, less controlled, as if the space itself had been freed from a function it no longer needed to perform, and Ethan felt it immediately, the absence of pressure, the quiet openness where restraint had been, and he took a single breath, deeper than before, not out of relief, but acknowledgement, and Lyra turned slightly, her gaze lifting toward the unseen layers of the empire that still surrounded them, still watching, still calculating, and for the first time, she did not feel defined by them, she felt separate, distinct, something more than the role she had fulfilled for so long, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, but no longer bound by expectation. This chamber no longer requires a directive, she said, not to the system, not to the council, but as a statement of reality, and the words carried, not as command, but as truth, settling into the space with a quiet authority that did not rely on enforcement, and Ethan stepped forward then, just one step, closing the distance that had once been impossible, not in defiance, not in urgency, but in understanding, and he stopped at her side, not behind her, not beneath her, simply beside her, and for a moment, the Empire watched, silent, unable to categorize what it was seeing, a human and an Empress. Standing without hierarchy, without division, without the structure that had always defined them, and Lyra did not correct it, did not restore the distance, she allowed it to remain, because in that simple alignment, something had changed that could not be reversed, not by systems, not by laws, not by the weight of an entire empire, and as the chamber lights slowly returned to a neutral glow, no longer cold, no longer sharp, just steady, the silence that followed carried a different kind of power, one that did not demand obedience, one that did not enforce order, but simply existed, and in that silence, the Empire learned something it had never been designed to understand, that control could be absolute, and still not be enough, because somewhere beyond its reach, beyond its calculations, beyond its laws, there was always the possibility of a choice, and sometimes, that choice would change everything without making a sound.